Okay, so welcome to Moses. We're going to just go through the basics of who Moses was, why is he so important, and hopefully get a brief outline of his life story and what he does. Okay, so Moses is basically a Jewish man who leads the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, if we remember back to our history, Jacob, who becomes Israel from the covenant, he has 12 sons, one of them being Joseph, and we know about Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat, and that's just a play and a musical. It's not important, but we have Joseph. Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ends up in Egypt, and he ends up being quite famous. He becomes like a really important person in the Pharaoh's court. Eventually, his brothers, because of famine in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, have to go to Egypt. They go to Egypt, they're accepted by Joseph, and they become part of Egyptian society. Now, over the time, those Israelites, those 12 tribes of Israel, become the slaves of the Egyptians. So by the time of Moses, we have the Israelites being slaves, and they are literally the bottom of Egyptian society. So at the time of Moses, we have male sons and male babies. Jewish babies were being killed, and so Moses' mother and his sister Miriam place him in a basket made out of reeds or papyrus on the River Nile and float him down. Now, as all good Jewish heroes, he's saved. And God saves him by having Pharaoh's daughter go down to the River Nile, and she finds him and she takes him and she raises him. And a little twist to the story, Miriam, who's watching to see what happens to her brother, introduces Pharaoh's daughter to Moses' mum, and Moses' mum becomes a wet nurse to Moses. So Moses grows up. He's growing up in Egyptian society. He's growing up in Pharaoh's palace, and for all intents and purposes, he's an Egyptian. Now, in terms of the Bible, we have basically 3 accounts of what happens to Moses during his early years and through his young adult life before he becomes the famous leader of the Israelites. We know that he has a deep commitment to fighting injustice, and we know that he actually kills a slave leader, which is quite bad. We also know that he flees to Midian, and he marries a woman called Zipporah, who's the daughter of one of the Midianite priests, and he becomes a shepherd to his father-in-law's flock. We also know that God appears to Moses as a burning bush at this time. So it's a bush that's burning, but it's not actually being consumed by the flames. And God says to him, and this is a really key quote that you need to get down, "I am who I am." And from that quote, and from that verse, we know that God is timeless, that he doesn't change, he's beyond our comprehension, and he is what he is. We can't actually explain who God is because he's not limited to our knowledge of the past, the present, the future, and what we actually understand in terms of knowledge. Eventually, God commands Moses to return to Egypt and to return to his brother Aaron and to make a request to free the Israelites because they're in slavery. So we have God returning Moses back to Egypt because, as it says in Exodus 3, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the land that God promised Abraham right in the beginning back in Genesis 12:3. So Moses goes back to Pharaoh. Pharaoh refuses to listen, and then he proves to Pharaoh through a series of 10 plagues that God is with him and that God does want the Israelites to leave. Eventually, after the plague of death, the Passover, where God sends the angel of death and it passes over all of the Israelite houses because they've painted lamb's blood on their mantles of their doors, Pharaoh gives in and he lets them leave because they've caused him so much trouble and so much pain and suffering because his eldest son, his most important child, has died. So Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt and they get caught by the Red Sea. And so the Israelites see that the Pharaoh, who's changed his mind, that he's advancing on them with his army, and they start questioning Moses, why have you led us out of Egypt to be faced by either death through the Red Sea or to face slaughter by Pharaoh's men and his army? God comes to the rescue. Moses holds out his hands and his staff, and God parts the Red Sea. So the Israelites cross, and then God lets the water of the Red Sea flow behind them, and it just so happens that Pharaoh's army also is washed away by the Red Sea. Now, the Israelites then go into the desert, and they stay in the desert for roughly 40 years. And they go there because they complain and they question God. While they're in the desert, they're also fed manna, which is bread from heaven, and they're starting to get into the ways of Jewish law in terms of they have a day of rest, and on that day, God doesn't give them any manna, and they have to collect extra manna on the Friday as it is, so that they do not have to cook or do anything on the Saturday. So we have the start of the Jewish Sabbath. Now, while they're in the desert, God gives them and makes the second covenant with Moses and the Israelites. And the second covenant is basically through the giving of the Torah, which is the Jewish sacred text, and it's the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. And within that Torah, it basically has the 613 mitzvot. Now, mitzvot is a word that you're going to come across time and time again. It basically means law or commandments. And part of those mitzvot are the 10 Commandments. Okay, it's a law given by God, and it's a way by which the Israelites can become and be God's chosen people. Now, the last thing is that Moses actually dies before he actually reaches or takes the Israelites into the Promised Land, and he dies at a place that we now call Jordan, and it's called Mount Nebo. You can see the Promised Land, he can see the land of milk and honey, you can see the land of Israel, but he isn't actually able to enter that land. That's left to Joshua. Okay, so here we just have a map of the route of the Exodus, and we know that they go through Egypt, they cross the Dead Sea, and they basically wander around the Sinai Peninsula. And it's in the Sinai Peninsula, right down the bottom, that they actually receive the 10 Commandments before they go up and they cross into the land of Israel. So 2 quotes, please get them down. And I'll give you, according to the watch, 10 seconds. And time's up. Okay, so the importance of Moses. Why is he important? The major idea behind Moses and why we constantly revere Moses and why we see him as important is because of the second covenant. He reaffirms what God said to Abraham and to his sons, and he actually gives the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, a way by which they can actually follow that covenant, and that is through the Torah and through the commandments. And that's known as the Mosaic Code after Moses. Also, we're also given knowledge of how to construct a dwelling place for God, and also a place by which to house these laws. And these laws are housed in a structure called the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this Ark of the Covenant is basically taken away. It's captured by the Babylonians in, I think, around 566, 580, and it's taken to Babylon and it's lost. And if we think about Indiana Jones is searching for the Ark of the Covenant, which is the original laws given by God to Moses back in the day. Okay, now some of you might be wondering, why doesn't Moses actually go to the Promised Land? And it all comes down to this excerpt from Numbers, which is the story of water from the rock. And if we have a look at just verse 6 onwards, we're having this idea of the Israelites being thirsty, they're constantly complaining because they're whingers, And they asked Moses, why have you taken us out of Egypt where we were suffering, but we had everything, and now you're going to make us die of thirst. So let's have a quick read. So Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink. Please note, speak to that rock before their eyes." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, see, now he actually speaks to the Israelites, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." So here we have a story where Moses doesn't trust the Israelites. He questions them and he berates them, and most importantly, he doesn't actually do what the Lord said. Now, this might seem really, really, really low-key. It might not be anything important, but Moses is a prophet. He is someone who has a relationship with God, who God speaks through. So God has to trust Moses. Moses has to trust God and has to follow him faithfully. Otherwise, he's not fulfilling his function as a prophet. So by speaking and berating the rebels rather than just doing what God asked, Moses forgoes any need, the ability to enter the promised land, because he doesn't trust in God, and he should have trust in God above all else. Just a picture of the River Jordan and looking out from Mount Nebo towards Israel. So if you have a look in the distance, that is Jericho. Okay, so here we go in terms of Moses as a prophet and what he should be doing. So Moses is a prophet of God. "I will be your mouth and teach you what you are to speak." So he is to do and say and act exactly as God wants him. "Any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods or who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die." So Moses doesn't die outright, but he doesn't actually go to the promised land, and that's particularly important because he leads them out, he goes on the journey, but he questions, he isn't able to finish off his journey. So that basically leaves us where we need to be. We need to know that Moses is a Jewish man who goes through and teaches the Israelites that God is with them even though they're in slavery. He leads them out of Egypt into the promised land. He receives the Torah and he receives the mitzvot and the commandments, and he basically allows the Jewish people to now be faithful to God because they know what they have to do. Really important, because everything a Jewish person does is based on the Torah, or comes from, or is interpreted based on teachings from the Torah. And what they do is based on or because of the mitzvot or the commandments given to Moses at Sinai. Cheers. And Mount Nebo in modern day Jordan.